Great. So I think we'll start diving in. So today we really want to talk about as Global Water Futures projects, get on with the research, getting into a phase of having some results and having had lots of interactions and meetings with partners, there might be an opportunity to start talking about the impact that your projects are making. And this is really an area that the KM team has been hearing quite a bit about from projects, from HQPs, from project managers. It's really questions around how do we know if knowledge mobilization is successful, and how do we evaluate it? How do we measure it? Is there a specific way that we should be going about doing it, or how do you want us to do it? And really, this webinar is a direct, attempt to try and contribute to some of that conversation and provide some potential options for evaluating and documenting impact. But we want to be clear that we're not, providing a prescriptive recipe for exactly how to do it. We're not submitting that you are required to do any of this. This is really just about us providing some guidance and some best practices. Because really at the end of the day, how you measure or document the success or the impact of your project really depends on what you're trying to achieve through your project and the activities that you've chosen to undertake to engage and get from research questions to having impact on water management in Canada. So we have kind of this running joke amongst the KM team and our close colleagues that it always depends. It depends. Knowledge mobilization, how you do it and how it's successful depends. So we're going to come back to that a couple of times today, but hopefully with a few concrete examples that will help you ground some of those options in examples that might make sense to you. So we hope by the end of this webinar, you come away with some thoughts on how you might start thinking about your success. You might see some indicators or measures that make sense to you that you would want to adopt. Perhaps some of our tips for how to track might be useful for you. So hopefully you come away with a better sense of how you can start to document your impact. I also just want to make note that kind of sprinkled throughout our presentation is little tidbits of how to do knowledge mobilization. We kind of struggle with trying to tease apart how to do knowledge mobilization and then how to evaluate it, because knowledge mobilization is it's an iterative process of bettering your research through engagement with your end users. And so it's difficult to put aside how you do knowledge mobilization in the conversation of how you know if you're doing it well. So there's a little bit of both sprinkled through here. Okay. So the importance of documenting your research, I think, I think that first of all, we have to, but there's a few more reasons other than that. Essentially, we have Global Water Futures specifically, but any applied research program or project has really created a lot of expectations with, among our partners, our users that are involved in our projects, but also, to kind of broader society that we have the ability to help solve some of these really big, wicked challenges that relate to water management in Canada. So documenting how we are doing with meeting that lofty goal is really important in helping us to maintain and even establish new relationships with our partners and collaborators. It's really a part of showing that their contribution and their relationship that you're developing is a critical aspect of the success of the project. And the more that you document and share the positive outcomes that you're generating in partnership with those people, the more other people, the more potential partners are going to see the benefit and identify with the successes and the potential that being a part of a research program like this or a project that you're working on will really benefit them, and it starts to attract people to you and to your research. You know, we really need to quantify and qualify and determine how our research is being used, and this is, I think, part of that bigger, broader question of kind of providing transparency and accountability to the use of significant public funding for a lot of this research. And we're being asked more and more, it's a requirement from large funders, from most funders really, that you're very explicit about how that money, that taxpayer money, is being used to solve problems that are identified as problems that are important to Canadians. And then, of course, you know, advancing your career. I think particularly earlier stage researchers are very, very interested and concerned about what's going on in the world and making a contribution to bettering water management in our case. Not just, you know, doing work, checking off the box, going home at the end of the day. We're all very passionate and involved in our research. So it's important for you personally to be able to articulate how your work is meeting your personal objectives of bettering water management. It's starting to become knowledge mobilization, community engaged scholarship is really starting to become an important aspect of your CV, and is slowly but surely making its way into things like the tenure application processes, things like that. It really helps develop you as a researcher that's trustworthy if you say that you are going to be engaging with communities and partners, and you've got successes to draw on in that realm. Then you become known as somebody who is engaged and genuinely is interested in problems that are affecting water managers' communities. And then, of course, it's really, really important to be able to justify your successes if you are transferring lessons and impacts from one project to leveraging funding for your next project. So very rarely do academics kind of box their research into one project. It's usually a project along a continuum that is meeting the needs of your kind of larger research area and your larger research interest, right? So, so the more you can show success iteratively from project to project, the more likely you'll be able to leverage funding. So I just wanted to touch quickly on kind of this notion that I said that we've created a lot of expectations with our users and our partners. Just to show you, this is taken from the Global Water Futures Stakeholder Needs Assessment, and this was done really early in the process of pulling together Global Water Futures program. And it really helps to kind of ground the research in what exactly are the needs of the different water sector players, so government, federal, provincial, municipal governments, also end users like food producers or First Nations communities, utilities or other industries, mining, oil and gas sector, insurance, engineering, and financing are increasingly looking to science for helping to answer questions related to risk, flood, drought risk, and how that affects the algorithms for insurance payouts and things like that. So we have this guiding document that really we should be kind of looking back to every once in a while. And I also want to note that Global Water Futures we're not expecting you to meet the needs of all of these sectors and all of their needs. It's just a guiding document for Global Water Futures to refer to, but really you should probably be able to see these needs reflected in your own project proposals and reflected in the activities and the products and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, because all of the sum of the parts of Global Water Futures projects lead into how Global Water Futures as a whole is delivering the needs to the water sector. So we also have requirements by TriCouncil agencies, and I mentioned this as well, but specifically the SHRC, the NSERC, the Health Research Institute, and CFREF, which is the program that is funding Global Water Futures, are now requiring not just a guidance, not just it would be great if you could do this, but it's actually specifically required to be awarded these types of grants, but also in your reporting back to them. So they all have slightly different versions of what kind of knowledge mobilization or impact looks like, depending on their discipline. But really, CFREF is really focused on kind of the strategic importance of this research to Canada, which means turning your research and your research discoveries into innovations, particularly in public policy, but also in terms of commercialization, technology transfer, things like that. So this is, you know, to get you motivated, I think, on a personal level, on an expectation and accountability to our partners level, but also a logistical kind of level of, you know, unfortunately, you also kind of have to do it. So I'm going to pass it over to Nancy, and she's going to get into some of the nitty-gritties about getting into evaluating your success.
Thanks, Stephanie. And just a reminder, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask them during the presentation in the chat box or feed. That's probably easier. And then we'll open up lines at the end of the meeting. So we spent a little bit of time in trying to prepare for this webinar, trying to figure out, you know, how do you evaluate the work that you're doing, and how do we help projects do that when projects are at different stages, when you're coming up with different activities. And so we thought that the easiest place to start is to really kind of take a step back and say, am I working on a process or am I working on an output, and how do I evaluate those? Because the difference between evaluating those is, you know, you would use different measures, you might use different tactics, and so it's really important to kind of distinguish between those two at the beginning. So, you know, essentially processes are the activities that you're doing to engage with stakeholders through your research, whereas the outputs can be thought of as the products that you're creating to develop the transfer of research knowledge. So, for example, well, and then I'll just say the outcomes is what you're really trying to achieve in the end. So, for example, if what you're trying to achieve is you're trying to help a community enhance their flood risk mitigation and keep homes safe from flooding. So that would be the outcome, right? That's what the work that we're trying to do is going to achieve. So then you would kind of work backwards. Maybe your output could be things like a map or a report that includes, you know, directions for which areas are at risk and what kind of mitigation strategies you might want to undertake. And then therefore your process might be your meetings with community planners, meetings with, you know, maybe even homeowners, trying to figure out what exists, what is the gaps, and what are the opportunities. So we're going to spend the next few slides kind of going through some of these in more detail. But you might also notice that some of the tools that we're going to suggest that you can use to evaluate your process or your input could actually be the same. So for instance, maybe you can use surveys to both understand the success of a stakeholder workshop as well as understanding the success of a map. And also we wanted to make sure that we're highlighting these different types of evaluations to point out that researchers don't need to think about, like, what you need to be thinking about is the success, like the impact of these activities that you're undertaking in an ongoing manner. So it's not just about undertaking your stakeholder workshops and your meetings in year one and then coming back a year later and trying to figure out whether or not they were successful. You're going to be thinking about these tools as you go, because it's way easier to survey people directly after a workshop and ask their input than it would be to wait till the end. The other thing to think about is that it's all about impact, right? We're looking for, we're trying to create both processes and outputs that are impactful. So it doesn't, if you take a step back and you think about it, it doesn't really matter whether or not you've published 10 journal articles or whether you've had 10 meetings with stakeholders. What actually matters in the end is whether or not those were impactful, whether they were actually able to get you to the solutions and the outcomes that you're looking for ultimately in the end. So it really matters what the quality of the work that you're putting together. So we're going to take you through and talk about, ways to measure metrics and try to ways to measure process and to understand whether or not they're having impact. Ways to measure your outputs and understand if they have impact. And then together that will really, kind of pull together and hopefully result in some of the outcomes of the research. So we thought we should also just take a moment to reflect on the impact of your research. So depending on your project, you're going to have different types of impacts that you're aiming for. And, impact is really broad. You're basically trying to influence things in the real world. Maybe you're trying to improve the quality of environment. Maybe you're trying to improve the quality of life for people. Maybe you're trying to impact technological process so that you're speeding things up and things can get done more quickly. So, depending on what type of impact you're actually aiming to achieve is going to depend on the types of processes and outputs that you're creating. I'm just going to take a sip of water because I'm losing my voice. So we'll begin with process. When you're trying to figure out how you document and evaluate the processes that you're using in your research strategy, it's good to understand what the goal of your impact is, like we were saying before. And if your goal is impact, having an impact on the real world, then ideally the processes that you're choosing are helping to foster a two-way knowledge exchange. So here we list a whole bunch of different examples of products, events, and networks. Some of these, like newsletters or handouts, are a little bit more sort of like, it's easier to think of them as one-way communication of research to your end users. And others are a little bit more on the end of the spectrum around co-creation. So maybe lunch and learns or workshops where you have lots of dialogue between end users and your researchers. Sometimes the real value that needs to be reported on is not the product itself, like I was saying before. It's not whether or not you have created a podcast. It's whether or not those were useful, whether or not they were helpful in trying to create the change that you're trying to. So this, when you're listing your products and you're trying to think about how successful they are, the other important thing is to kind of take this moment to also reflect on the success of these things in order to report that, but also to look forward and say whether or not you should be using different products or processes in order to do a better job of linking with your end users and hearing back from them what they have to say. So here we've listed a few ways that you might want to start thinking about how to measure the success of a process. So you could think about what's how many times and the type of knowledge exchange activities that you've undertaken, the number and the type of products or services that have been disseminated with partner collaboration. So maybe you're actually working with the community to get this information out. And satisfaction levels. So, after we had our workshop for infographics in Waterloo, we sent out a survey to both the researchers that were present and also the end users that were present and ask them what they thought of it. Did they think that was a successful event? Would they come back to a future event? So that we could actually understand whether or not they were satisfied with the level of knowledge exchange. And, there's a number of different ways in order to capture some of that information. Like I had mentioned, you can use surveys, workshop evaluation forms, whether that's at the event or after the event. You can also just talk to people, and you can, sort of make it sound formal by talking about sharing circles. But, you can tell stories and understand. You can interview people. You can have focus groups, whether they're informal or formal. Testimonials, like just asking people whether or not they thought that was useful. So another, specific example here is if you're trying to understand the impact of your research, you need to do more than just count up the number of people that you've talked to or the partners that you've engaged with. You also need to understand whether or not those partnerships are really effective at fostering this two-way communication to meet the needs of those people. So how do you evaluate whether or not you're creating value for your partners? One way is to, like I had kind of said before, to talk to them. So for instance, in the Canadian Water Network with some of their projects, they actually asked their projects to go out and get a letter from their stakeholders to understand whether or not the stakeholders, like from their perspective, how they thought the research process was going. Another really good tip is to keep track through some sort of Google Doc or spreadsheet, who you're talking to, what types of conversations you're having. Sometimes these small conversations may not seem like they're that valuable while you're having it. They might not, you might not, capture the most important details, but if you're writing it down, you might kind of go back and it all adds up to the aha moment that you're trying to come up with. And then also, this can help keep track of different partners and what different partners are looking for. So, some partners want to be really engaged and they want to be involved in sort of every step along the way. And some partners are totally fine with you just coming to them once every year or 6 months to let them know how things are going. So you can't brush them all with one stroke, and starting to keep track of your conversations helps you distinguish where people are at, because ideally you'd be able to ask them, how much do you want to be involved? But usually they don't really know, and sometimes that changes over time. So it's really important to try to take that onus on yourself and define it for your own self and your team, and keeping track of it in a document can be really helpful. So I'm going to switch gears to outputs now. There's a lot of similarities between trying to track and evaluate the processes that you're using compared to the outputs. But, outputs are really things like, like I had said before, what you're trying to communicate in your research. So you can do that through magazines, articles, newsletters, policy briefs. It's, the actual map or the model that you're creating, various toolkits, platforms. There's sort of a lot of different ways that you can summarize the outcomes of, or the major conclusions of your research and communicate that outwards to your end users and your partners, or the people who are going to be using your research. So the ways that you can measure the success of those outputs, also are very broad and can run the spectrum. You can think about use indicators. So things like, how many people are not only using the information, but maybe they're adapting it to their own circumstance. So maybe they take a policy, toolkit that you've created, and they've added a local flavor to it so that it made sense for their own community, and they're distributing that. Maybe they're actually using it to inform training. So you'd have to think through, depending on what kinds of outputs you're creating, you're going to have different use indicators, but here are just some examples. You can also think about, different qualitative examples. So, some of the capturing numbers can be very quantitative, but you can also think about this process as being qualitative. You could try to understand, has the new knowledge changed attitudes? So, I don't know, if you're working on waste management issues, have people change their behaviors when it comes to recycling after they've learned about the new things that you've taught them. So you can try to understand, whether there's been changes to policies or programs, whether services have been offered in a different way. Usually you can do this through some of these tools on the screen. We've mentioned things like surveys a number of times. There's web analytics in order to try to capture things such as numbers of downloads. You can actually attend the annual general meetings of the organizations that you are trying to influence to understand what types of conversations they're having. So, for instance, if you're working on Great Lakes policy, you might want to be attending the Great Lakes Executive Committee meetings, which are open to the public and happen every 6 months. It's a good opportunity to understand what are the types of conversations they're having, how do they summarize the scientific knowledge that they're getting and turn that into policy. And from there you can use that as an opportunity to have input into their process, but you can also understand whether or not any of the science you've put forward is actually being used to inform policy thinking. Because it's not like all of that is written up into neat documents. Policy analysts don't always know where all their ideas come from, so it can be also hard to make that cause and effect link as well. So this is tough stuff. We're just trying to throw out some ideas for you to think about in terms of how you might start going about trying to measure the success of these outputs. And just to kind of try to solidify some of this, we thought we'd bring in this example of something that a lot of students and academics are very familiar with. So if you're trying to understand the success of a journal article that you have written, you might turn to some of these tools on the screen, right? So that you can understand not only say that you have published in this journal article, but to explain how effective that has been. So you might look at how many people have cited that article. You might look at the number of downloads of the article. You might look at different levels of reach in order to understand the effectiveness of that. So similarly, you can apply the same logic to the other types of products that you're producing, whether that's a magazine article, which is a lot of similarities, or maybe it's a workshop or a policy brief that you're producing. I think I passed this on to Stephanie at this point.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm just going to jump in here now with an example around pulling all of these pieces together to kind of craft a whole narrative from your process, your output, to your impact and kind of broader hopes for social impact on water management in Canada. So this is kind of a more fulsome knowledge mobilization related example that's very timely. I'm personally working on and a few more people within Global Water Futures as well. So basically, through our participation in the water sector in Canada, we know that the management is really fragmented between the mandates and the jurisdictions of the federal government and the provincial government to manage water, and that often creates inconsistencies in how that happens across the country, across provinces and territories. And we do have federal legislation called the Canada Water Act that does enable this kind of transboundary partnership from federal to provincial to local to territorial to Indigenous governments. But it's really out of date. It doesn't really consider how things have changed in the last 40 years since it was developed, doesn't consider major changes in our climate and in our hydrologic cycle, and it certainly doesn't reflect our kind of now more appreciation for Indigenous rights and water management in Canada. So Global Water Future scientists got together with a number of experts in water policy and law and governance, some retired civil servants who really understand how governments function and work and their roles, their jurisdictions around water in Canada, and also retired political officials who understand kind of that more how decisions are actually made, how science can contribute to policy development, but other things also influence policy development. So we've all come together, and so our process is to come together in a collaborative to work together to bridge and bring all these different types of expertise to the table. So we have come together physically in a workshop to talk about ideas and talk about ways that Canada needs to reform federal water policy, and from our different backgrounds, what are the components that would make better federal water policy in Canada, and what are the problems that we see across the country that could be solved or enabled by a modernized piece of legislation. We also have joint calls, kind of bi-weekly or monthly, and so we're continuing this iteration. We're building it together. We're co-creating, and so that's our process. Our output, so we're building something together. We're co-creating a recommendations document. Many of you may have seen in the latest Global Water Futures newsletter a nod to this work where we will be convening a strategic briefing in Ottawa in April, and our output that we're bringing to this meeting is a recommendations document that we all created together. We all had to do the nitty-gritty work to kind of overcome different ways of how we would all, from different perspectives and different backgrounds, put a document like this together, the focused area, how we kind of make the case for needing water reform in Canada, water policy reform in Canada. But the process of coming together to hash that out, that co-creation process, has really built a much better, more robust, holistic picture of what we need in the end. So we're going to come together with another output, which is a gathering. We've invited all politicians, MPs from all across Canada, from all political stripes, key water sector leaders, scientists from Global Water Futures, and again, more experts in water policy and kind of government governance. And so we're going to have that conversation, and we're going to continue to kind of co-create as a water sector in Canada what we'd like to see happen to better things like flooding and drought, and to be able to manage those situations that are increasingly hitting us and becoming increasingly challenging for us as a country to grapple with. And so at the end of the day, we can't really yet evaluate, whether or not we have better transboundary flood forecasting or better emergency preparedness, which will eventually reduce the amount of property or lives lost in Canada. But we hope to be able to. But what we can do is evaluate our processes and our outputs. So we'll have a briefing after our meeting in Ottawa to talk about our team's work and how that all came together. Maybe we need to make amendments moving forward on how we continue to work together. We can evaluate the success by whether partners want to continue to work together. That's a really good kind of indicator that people are satisfied with how things are going, that they want to re-engage in the process and develop next steps together. We'll be able to evaluate the success of our outputs, our recommendations document, by some web analytics, like how many downloads and views that it received. From our national meeting, we will be able to know, how many people were invited, how many of those actually attended, as an indicator of this is important to those people, and so we're actually building, outputs and conversations that are meaningful and relevant to people that they'll show up to. And then we'll get some qualitative feedback through the discussions at that meeting about people's ideas and how our recommendations are being, landing with water managers across Canada, and that we'll be able to take that feedback through the next steps to figure out kind of, a larger strategy for pushing some of these concepts through. And then we'll be watching this unfold over the course of, the year, the next few years. We have an election cycle in Canada coming up. Perhaps we'll be able to see some of our thoughts, our concepts, our ideas, our recommendations, taken up in some national dialogues. Maybe it starts to show up in, media stories or into campaign messages or election platforms, things like that. Speeches, political speeches. Those are really good kind of little indicators that your message is getting picked up, it's useful, it's tangible, and it's relevant to people who are looking for that information. So, I think at the end of the day, we really do hope to be able to eventually be able to measure that we did reduce lives lost or property lost in Canada, that insurance payouts are decreasing, or that the federal government is decreasing its disaster assistance payments, which is given out after a major event like a flooding or a drought, and that's really impacting the Canadian economy over the last decade. So that's our strategic importance to Canada through that piece of work. So that's one example. I tried to craft a little bit of a story for you from looking at how people come together, the processes that they develop, and the activities that they come up with in order to achieve a longer-term impact. What were the products developed? How are they being used, and how are they actually translating into impact? So that's what you want to do. You want to be able to bring all those components together in a little bit of an impact story that's compelling, that I think shares the progression of your project. So where did you start, and where have you ended up, or what place are you at in the project now, to see that progression over time. You really want to focus on, specifically for Global Water Futures end user-led solution projects. We really, a lot of our impact and our successes relates around that end user perspective. How were they engaged? What equal footing did we give partners in that research process, and how they felt meaningfully engaged in how their ideas were encouraged to be put on the table, and that they were actually taken up. And you could see that in the evolution of the research methodology. One really great piece of information is how science, or how your project is training the next generation of scientists, but also practitioners. Many students get out of academia and move into positions within government or the consulting world. And so how is this project contributing to increasing the capacity? That's something that is also very strategic relevance to Canada and the workforce and our intellectual capacity. So all of these things, and of course the take-home message, if you can get there, is what is that environmental or social or economic challenge that you've made better through this research and this process of mobilizing knowledge amongst scientists, users, potential stakeholders. That is really that's the meat that that people want to know about. They aren't as interested in how we refined our methodology and how the significance level or those nitty-gritties as scientists were so proud that we kind of nailed down. People really want to know, but why? Like why and how and what was the difference that you made in the world? What was the solution that you provided for the challenge that you've identified? And again, a good story provides kind of a mix of those quantitative and qualitative measures. And I've got another example. I know this is a lot of text, but I pulled this. Research Impact Canada is a great resource They provide some blogs and some space for case studies from partner organizations, and many universities in Canada are members of this organization. So this is just a really quick, a couple of paragraphs. This would be like kind of a great link for throwing into an annual report, and it's really got most of the elements. It's not perfect. It's got a lot of elements that I think we've touched on in this webinar. So, they've talked about the fact that this is a partnership. So it's university, scientists, and also community-based organization. They talked about what they worked on together. So they worked on a food charter. That food charter has then become kind of this staple document that many people in the food security world, at least in this York region, are looking to for guidance around food-related policies and services for their region. And actually, it's been formally adopted by a number of communities, committees, and councils. Well, that's great. That's a very tangible, quantitative measure that you could include. They've got some more numbers around how much money they've leveraged. It's an indicator that people who are passing out money are considering that this project is really relevant to the goals that they're trying to achieve. So some numbers, and then a little nod to how this is impacting kind of more broadly. So this organization has through this document been able to kind of insert themselves into strategic conversations around building stronger, healthier, more prosperous communities in this region. We don't yet know if this has led, actually, in tangible measures, led to, better food security for this region, or lower poverty rates, or healthier people, or more access to local food. But I think the point here is that you have lots to measure and document before you get to that kind of pie in the sky ultimate goal that your project might be trying to achieve. So there's lots of things to measure in the meantime, and then you have to keep your eye. Where does this research go from your finish point to the next? So maybe you adopt the next step in a next research program, or somebody else picks it up and builds on it, and eventually gets to the point of contributing to those metrics, like I mentioned, food security, poverty. So you really have to, and a lot of times in order to see impact, you kind of have to keep your eye to the issue for a longer time. So I alluded to the Research Impact Canada. We wanted to show a few more resources. Nancy and I were swimming in resources as we tried to pull this webinar content together, and sometimes it can be very overwhelming. What do I use? How do I use it? But there are a lot of toolkits and planning tools from working through, what is my objective? What do I want to achieve at the end of this project? And the steps along the way, the activities, the process, the outputs that I need to generate along the way. The Canadian Water Network is a kind of a precursor to Global Water Futures, and so they have a lot of documentation on their website. They have some really great kind of what they call impact snapshots. So they, requested of their funded projects to really distill their research into a two-pager that was a little templated. So they had, what is your research, some quick points about your methodology, but then really what is the relevance to the partners that were included in this study. And that's a great communication or knowledge mobilization piece that can be used. We also wanted to, make a nod to the fact that this is challenging. It's not easy, and there's a lot of challenges that can, keep you from feeling like you are clearly measuring success. And there's a million ways of slicing and dicing it. I think the time lag is one of the major challenges that we see is that researchers or people working in a project just don't have time to see those broader impacts realized in the life of their one specific project. And that can be a challenge because funders want to know, or because your partners really want to know. So maybe you feel forced into kind of creating that that impact, or talking about impact that you don't yet feel you can take credit for. But again, there's lots to be able to measure and evaluate your success along the way, and that's where the process and the outputs really help you. And it's probably where most global water futures project evaluations are at this stage, but moving into impact, larger scale impact for sure. Development of nature of the impact, having impact doesn't kind of happen today or tomorrow. It's an iterative process over time, and it's not just about you. It's built on, right? And so how do you kind of carve out what your contribution has been can feel a little bit challenging. So that's really where helping to track your research directions and how they evolve over time from one project to the next, how your research agenda is evolving based on that, the opportunities that arise for your research, but also to take advantage of things that you can have direct impact on. And then it's not always, it's not always just you. It kind of takes a village to make change, and research science is really only one input into that process. And I think many of us would be aware today in the world, evidence and science is not necessarily the driving force, or information is not necessarily the driving force in decision making. And so we have to be aware of what else is kind of going on in the world that is influencing change, and try to use that to our advantage, but also be aware of the things that are also pushing back against that. And then gathering the evidence is one thing that many projects find hard, and Nancy talked about a tracking tool that we've developed. Trying to collect stuff along the way is really important and makes your life easier. In the moment, it feels like it's more work, but at the end, to be able to go back and grab all that tracking that you've been doing really makes your life easier come reporting time. So we're all muddling through this together. And I'll just reiterate, the knowledge mobilization team is here to help if you are looking for some advice on you've got some objectives you're trying to achieve, but you're not quite sure how to measure them, or what tools you should be using to measure them. Then please come and have a more direct one-on-one conversation with us. So we felt like this type of webinar was a bit timely, also because of the Global Water Futures annual reporting that's coming up due at the end of April. And while we are not trying to give you a template or give you requirements of how to do this, Global Water Futures has provided a template for annual reporting. But we felt like there was an opportunity to help projects pull some of their metrics together and create an impact story that can be easily put into the Global Water Futures questions around listing your scientific and technical and knowledge mobilization advances over the past year. So here's where you have a great opportunity to kind of craft that couple of paragraphs that really capture the essence of your process and your outputs, and how that is leading to some of those solutions, and including those quantitative and qualitative measures to kind of craft that compelling 1 to 2 paragraphs. Of course, you also have opportunity to also count up your products and your publications and your academic writings, but also your other science and public outreach materials, and your articles and your citizen science tools, or your newsletters. So you can count stuff up, but you also have an opportunity to provide a compelling narrative, and that's really what we are hoping that this webinar is helping you to formulate in your head already. Many of you on the webinar might not actually be kind of in charge of your reporting. Maybe you are, but if you're a student or you're a postdoc, you're probably apt to be asked to contribute content for the annual report. And so this is a really good opportunity for you to start thinking about from your own kind of slice of the project's perspective. So again, the team is here to help. Nancy and I are undertaking some what we're calling dialogues or year-end conversations with projects, really trying to kind of pull out this discussion. Having somebody ask a few questions to get you thinking about your engagement activities or the usefulness of the products that you've been developing or the influence that you think that you're making with your partners and broader society really can help kind of get the juices flowing and get that conversation going, and we can prompt and we can help pull the strings a little bit. So we're really wanting to help look back over this past year and pull that together tangibly for your report, because that's something that you've got to do, and we feel we want to be value added in the things that you have to work on. But also it's an opportunity to look forward as well. And this is where that kind of coming together of how do you do knowledge mobilization and how do you evaluate its success kind of comes together. You can make changes, or you can prioritize your activities for the next 12 to 18 months based on the usefulness or the successes of your past year or past 2 years of Global Water Futures, to really hone in on, okay, what activities are we going to focus on? What are we going to prioritize and pick to make sure that, especially over the last year of phase 1, we're getting to that point of seeing impact and being relevant to our end users, and that makes a great case for re-engaging them for phase 2 potentially, or thinking about the evolution of your research questions for phase 2. So we're prioritizing Pillar 3 projects for that, just because they have the most user-led and user engagement. So we're going to prioritize those, but anybody else that wants to have that kind of conversation is more than welcome to get in touch with us. I think that's it in terms of the content that we wanted to provide you. More than happy to open it up. We booked the webinar for another half an hour in hopes of having a little bit of discussion. Are folks, starting to think about reporting and pulling together metrics? Have any questions or need any help with kind of answering some of those challenges that you might be facing and trying to pull that information together? Nancy, do you have anything you wanted to kind of end as we wrap up the content?
I think that was a good overview. Just to reiterate, we're not trying to make it more difficult to report on research successes, but what we're trying to do is help use reporting to also improve our processes as well. So it's just an opportunity to reflect on how we've been doing so far and use that to rethink some of the tools that we're using or the approaches that we're using. So, maybe at the end you say, I did that workshop, but I really didn't follow up and ask people whether or not that worked for them. And so if, the next time you do a workshop, you can improve your process. And that's all we're doing here. We're all continuously learning. And so we want to help with that process of learning. So does anyone have any questions or, challenges that they might want to bring to the table for us to collectively brainstorm together? You are all muted, so if you do want to speak, you can either unmute yourself or raise your hand, or you can also put your question in the chat box.
And I'm also interested in whether people, feel like this overview is helpful, useful. We're doing our own, evaluation here of what people want, and we hear a lot that people want to know more about how do we know we're successful. And so this was our attempt. It was difficult to kind of piece this together in a bit of a, framework. So let us know if it was useful or not, or if we missed the mark, what would be more useful for you in pulling together your research impact.
Well, if you don't want, we don't have to carry on this conversation if it's not something that that you guys have questions about now. But keep in mind that our doors are always open, and we're more than happy to. Well, one, yes, we will actually absolutely share a copy of the slide deck along with surprise, surprise, a survey to ask for some feedback, because we're trying to figure out whether or not these things are useful for people, and if it's and if so, how can we improve them? Because we want to constantly be undergoing an improvement process. So we will share copies of the presentation and the survey, maybe, if not today, hopefully Monday, so it's fresh in your mind. And please be honest, we're not, if this didn't go well for you or if it wasn't valuable, just let us know. That's okay. And yeah, like I was saying, anytime anybody wants to drop by, they're more than welcome to. Marie, I know that you unmuted yourself. Does that mean you have a question? Okay. Well, Marie, you can always call me or come and send an email. So, we can't hear you.
Oh, it looks like she's trying to talk, but we can't hear her.
For some reason, we're having some difficulties with this speaker working in WebEx.
Feel free to type it in if you want.
I'm just wondering whether Marie's typing a question.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
He wants to say that these webinars are useful to hear, even if there isn't much discussion after. So silence is not an indicator of our success or not.
Sometimes you can rule out your indicators too. Okay, well, thank you so much for everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. If you have ideas for further webinars as well, please let us know. We're always happy to consider that. And I hope everyone enjoys their Friday afternoon and the weekend.
And we have one more webinar in this kind of first series, which will be held April 12th, and that's going to focus on youth engagement, and we'll have our knowledge mobilization specialists, Andrew Spring and Stephanie Morningstar, talk about some of their work, particularly in the North and with Indigenous youth, but also others. So if that's of interest to you, please tune into that and share that with your colleagues.